philosophy. Today we're going to be covering a topic that's been plaguing the geek culture and the youth for decades since the 1950s. And that's the question, is comic books still for kids? With all the violence and innuendos and disproportionate body images, can we really say that kids can enjoy comic books like they did in the past? Well, to answer that question, we're going to have to take a look back at comics history and see how they got from point A to where they are now. So, firstly, if we're going to talk about comics, we got to talk about its predecessor, the comic strip, which is known to be really coming around in the 18th century, late 18th century, early 19th century, but some even say it started as far as the 12th century Indo-Japan period. Some even say that comic strips originated from ancient Greek vase painting. But nevertheless, we see actual physical evidence in the late 18th century in Asia and Europe. So starting from there, going across the seas, now we're in America, and in 1840 we actually get our first real prototype to the comic book. And that's with the Adventures of Mr. Obadiah Oldbuck. Now, it's a comic way back, and it does have its date issues, but it's the predecessor. It's pretty much the prototype that we see now. So let's just say it's not really my taste, but images aren't badly drawn. Now, fast forward almost a whole century, we go into 1933, where the first official comic book was represented in a magazine called Famous Funnies. And that was just a culmination of several different comic strips from newspapers and so forth, all combined in one magazine. So separate from the newspapers, and something that kids and parents who enjoy reading the funnies can just pick up and just read that, instead of asking, hey, hand me the funnies. So fast forward a little bit more, now we're in 1938, where we see the first issue of Action Comics with Superman. Alright? Now, this is where we see the superhero genre start its popularity, and this is normally called the Golden Age of comic books, led by writers like Joe Shuster, Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster, Bob Kane, and Bill Finger, and just to name a few, and many more after that. Now, the Golden Age was the peak of comic book eras. Children were reading it left and right. And then we go into the Silver Age in 1954 with Showcase issue number 3, introducing the first, or really the second, Flash, but we know him as the first, Barry Allen. But the Silver Age didn't just come out of the blue. It did come out with some baggage. And that was from a book that was written called Seduction of the Innocent in 1954 by a psychiatrist known as Frederick Wertham. Now, he suggested that there was too many innuendos and bad advertisement in comic books seducing our children, which caused a couple people to raise their eyebrows. And not just parents, but it also raised the eyebrow of the Senate Committee for the Juvenile Disciplinary. Now, the Juvenile Disciplinary couldn't really do a lot to regulate it because it is a form of freedom of speech. But they did come up with the Comic Code Authority. What they did was they pretty much just read comics and put their stamp of approval saying, hey, this is safe for your children to read. So if a parent was browsing through comic books for their kids, or their child was coming up to them in the grocery store like, hey, I want to buy this comic, the parent can look for this stamp saying it was approved by the Comic Code Authority and saying, hey, this is safe for your children to read. Now, great in theory, it didn't really last long, as Marvel and other publishers start avoiding it in the 1970s, going away around it. And then really DC followed suit years later in the early 2000s, going into 2011 is when they stopped using it. And then at that point, the Comic Code Authority was defunct. There was no need for it. Now, fast forward again, now we're in the modern age of comics, in the late 80s, early 90s. And what we see a crop of brand new generation of writers and artists at the helm, like, Jim Lee, Jeff Loeb, just to name a few, Alex Ross. But as these influential new generation writers and artists started, we also start seeing a decline in comic books. At this point, the readers that grew up on it were older and couldn't relate to some of the stories, and the younger generation couldn't obtain some of the story. So what people tried to do was actually make it more tailored for mature audiences. As the audience grew, they made the comics grow with them. And this also gave the new generation of writers something more to write than just the old stories. We came up with more real life topics and situations that we put our superheroes in. Now, even though we saw the sales debunk or get some publications become financially troubled, we start seeing another rise in the early 2000s as the superhero movie genre start bumping up. Now, movies like Blade, Spider-Man, Batman Begins start cropping up and then start bringing more readers back in. But as more readers came in, it was an influx. It was older to young generations. So, now that we've talked about how we've gotten here, how comics have gotten here today, let's look back at the question, is comic books still for children? And if we look at that question, I come up with 3 different theories for it. Theory number 1, that comic books are no longer for children. They've tended to the mature audience that can buy them. So now, it's not for kids, it's only for adults. Theory number 2, comic books were never really for kids, as Frederick Fernham said. There's too many hidden messages and propaganda for kids to read comic books, so it was never meant for them. And theory 3, comic books is for everybody, for young and old. So let's look back at those 3 theories. The first theory is actually a slippery slope fallacy. Just because the audience grew up doesn't mean that it's no longer for the newer audience as a younger generation. For example, a silly example, I ate Justice League shaped macaroni and cheese when I was younger by Kraft, powdered, not the squeezable cheese, but powder mixed with milk and butter. Bam, you got something good. That was when I was younger. Now fast forward 20 years, now I'm 30, and now I like a 6 cheese blend spices with a rigatoni noodles as my mac and cheese. So let's call it the 6 cheese adult mac and cheese. My taste buds matured. I don't eat the Kraft mac and cheese anymore. I eat the adult version of the mac and cheese. Now, with that first theory, that means this mac and cheese that I now eat as an adult cannot be given to a child. This mac and cheese has an MA rating on it. Now, how silly does that sound? Food having an MA rating on it just because my taste buds matured, that the younger generation can't eat it? It's the same with comics. Now, theory number 2 is also a fallacy. It's actually a false dilemma fallacy. Just because there are hidden messages and propaganda, possibly in comics, does not mean that it's not for children. For example, there was a lot of propaganda and so forth in World War I and World War II. Let's face it, when it came to Captain America, you want to see him fight some Nazis back in World War II. And that wasn't a great message of violence, but it was a great message for children that had their families, our fathers and our mothers going across seas and fighting Nazis. So if little Timmy was wondering where his dad was, he can pick up an issue of Captain America, see that he's over there fighting Nazis with Captain America. That's a good message. So, as far as propaganda, not all propaganda is bad propaganda, and not all hidden messages are bad. Sometimes it sparks conversation that need to be held. Now, the third one is actually what I think is the correct answer, and that is comic books are for everyone, for young and old. It's almost like football. There's different levels of football. You start with flag football, pee-wee football, middle school, high school, college, and then you go into, hopefully, the NFL. There's different levels of football, just like there's different levels of comics. You can pick up age-appropriate comic books for your children that are in a certain age group. For example, my daughter's 2, she reading comic books? No, but she likes superheroes, so I read comic books to her. So I'm going to do something a little bit more age appropriate, like Teeny Titans from the 2000 years. Or I would do Baby Avengers. I'm actually looking forward to introducing my daughter to Superhero Girls, DC Superhero Girls, when their comic book comes out in the next couple months. So there's an example of something I can read to my daughter, and then that's something that she can pick up and start reading herself. Now, if we look at that question, there's also another part to it, and that is there's more benefits to children reading comic books than there is to not read comic books or read at all. So, when it comes to education and how the mind develops, the earlier a child's read to or reads shows that they have better test scores in the future. And one way of really determining that is looking at our school system now. So from kindergarten to third grade, most children are learning to read. They're learning the ABCs, they're learning sentence structures, they're learning punctuation, they're learning how to write paragraphs. That's what they're doing from kindergarten to third grade. Now, from third grade on, they're actually reading to learn. So now it's, hey, read chapter 4 of this book and read it and comprehend it. So if you get your children more involved in reading at an earlier age, that's more beneficial to them and their testing. And that leads to, hopefully, a better life if you're more educated. At least that's what they tell us. So, thinking about that, those are 3 theories. We've identified that the first 2 are fallacies and the first one is the correct answer. But at the same time, here at Geek Philosophy, there are no facts until you really believe them. So, if you have any other suggestions, or if you feel like I'm wrong, please write down in the comments below and subscribe to my channel. And also, please, if you do feel like this message has touched you, like the channel, please subscribe. Check out our social media, links down below. And we'll be coming out with more videos like this on a weekly basis, doing about 2 to 3 videos a week. But thanks again for your time. Geek Philosophy, the Geek Way of Thinking. Have a great time, y'all.